You usually think about the concept of a border with, uh, I guess, a sense of absolute finality, right? Like a border is a line drawn on a map or a physical wall or maybe a heavily guarded checkpoint.
Right, exactly.
And for the last several centuries of international politics, that border has functioned very much like the locked front door of a private home. What happens outside the house, out on the street, well, that is the neighborhood's business.
Yeah, everyone can see it.
But what happens inside? That is intensely private. It is sovereign territory. But I want you to just imagine for a second that you are walking past that house and you hear something terrible happening inside.
Oh, well, yeah.
Like you hear violence, someone is screaming for help. At what point do you decide to actually kick the door down? Welcome to the 11th deep dive of our Diplomacy and International Relations Summer Series.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a really hard look at a fundamental and honestly striking question, which is, when, if ever, should the international community cross a sovereign border to stop a government from harming its own people?
It really is the single most agonizing dilemma in the international system today.
Yeah.
I mean, we are looking at a space where the desperate moral urgency to save human lives just collides head-on with harsh, unforgiving political realism.
Yeah, it's messy.
It is incredibly messy.
Yeah.
We have to decide whether we respect that locked door you mentioned, fully aware that people are suffering behind it, or if we break it down, knowing that the violence of breaking it might cause the entire neighborhood to just collapse into warfare.
Which honestly bridges perfectly from our previous deep dive into global poverty.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because in that exploration, we focused heavily on economic security. We were looking at what political scientists call freedom from want, right? We were analyzing the structural inequalities of global wealth.
Right.
But today, we are shifting the lens entirely. We are moving from economic security to physical and human security. We are looking at freedom from fear.
Which is an essential pivot to make, I think. Because all the economic development models and the trade agreements and the poverty alleviation strategies we discussed previously, none of that really means anything if a population is living under the imminent daily threat of mass violence.
Right. You can't exactly build a thriving economy if you are fleeing a war zone.
Exactly.
So for this session, we are analyzing a very specific stack of source materials that trace the historical evolution of human protection.
And it is a dense stack of materials.
It really is. Our mission today is to examine the incredible structural tension between state sovereignty and human rights, and to thoroughly dissect the highly controversial doctrine known as the responsibility to protect.
Right.
And I am joined, as always, by our resident expert who is here to help synthesize these incredibly heavy concepts. Before we jump in, I just want to quickly remind you all to follow and subscribe wherever you're listening.
Always helpful.
And remember, you can also subscribe on our Patreon to help keep this show running. That gives you access to extra deep dives, as well as our weekly and monthly briefings on Danish politics, which are super relevant right now. The link for that is down in the description.
Yes, definitely check that out. And hello to you listening. As we get into these sources today, we really need to set a very analytical, grounded tone.
Yeah, we can't just be purely emotional about this.
Exactly. The material we are analyzing today is not just about lofty utopian ideals. It is about the brutal realities of geopolitical power and military logistics and the really intricate mechanics of international law.
It's the nuts and bolts of how the world actually runs.
Yeah, we are looking through a lens that forces us to acknowledge both the desperate human need to prevent atrocities and the often tragic unintended consequences of actually deploying military force to try and stop them.
So let's start by unpacking the core paradox that our sources highlight right at the beginning of the text. Because the entire modern international order, the system we live in today is built on a bedrock foundation of state sovereignty and non-interference.
That's the baseline rule.
Right, and that assumption has basically been codified since the end of the Second World War in 1945. It assumes that states exist primarily to protect their own citizens. Like, that is their fundamental job description.
But the historical reality.
Yeah, and this is a very dark realization presented in the text, but the historical reality is that individuals generally face the greatest threats of mass violence, not from foreign armies invading across a border, but from their own governments.
It is a devastating paradox. We built a global society of states based on one overriding rule, which is nobody is allowed to interfere in anyone else's domestic affairs.
The locked door.
The locked door, exactly. The United Nations Charter is fundamentally prefaced on this idea. You have to remember the architects of the UN had just survived World War II, so their primary goal was to prevent states from invading each other.
Right, they just wanted to stop cross-border wars.
Right. So to achieve that, they privileged the security of the state above almost everything else. They were operating on the assumption that a secure state acts as a shield for the individuals living inside it.
But the 20th century pretty much shattered that assumption, didn't it?
Completely. The sources point out that tens of millions of people were systematically killed by their own governments. You look at Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Stalin in the Soviet Union, or the Rwandan genocide.
It's horrific.
The death toll inflicted by sovereign governments upon their own citizens vastly exceeds the number of people killed in wars fought between different states.
Wow. I mean, when you put it like that, it really frames the problem. If the state is the predator rather than the protector, what is the rest of the world supposed to do?
That's the million-dollar question.
Do we just watch?
Uh-huh.
The sources provide a really fascinating theoretical framework for how the international community has historically wrestled with this exact dilemma.
Yeah, I love how they lay this out.
They map the debate out along two different intersecting axes. The first axis basically measures whether you believe moral progress is actually possible in world politics. You either fall into the optimistic camp, believing we can evolve, or the pessimistic camp, which the text refers to as the tragic view.
Right, and then the second axis measures who you believe the primary actor in international relations actually is, or at least who it should be.
Right, like state versus individual.
Exactly. Do you privilege the state as the ultimate authority, or do you privilege the individual human being?
Okay, so when you cross these two axes, you end up with a matrix of four distinct ethical positions. And the text suggests these four quadrants essentially dictate every argument you hear in the news today regarding whether the international community should intervene in a foreign crisis.
They absolutely do.
So, okay, let's unpack this matrix slowly, because understanding this completely changes how you process international news. Position number one is the optimistic and state-centered view.
Right, so this perspective is deeply rooted in pluralism. They believe that progress in international affairs is definitely possible, but it acknowledges that the world is incredibly diverse.
Right, lots of different systems.
Yeah, we have radically different cultures and religions and political systems. So because of that diversity, this view argues that the only way to achieve progress without sparking just endless conflict is through voluntary rule-bound cooperation between states.
So they really like laws and procedures.
Very much so. They want an international society governed by strict laws, primarily the UN Charter.
And their main argument against intervening to stop atrocities is that intervention basically causes structural disorder.
Yes, they hate disorder.
Right. Like, if we establish a norm where states are allowed to cross borders to promote human protection, powerful countries will inevitably just excrete that rule.
Oh, 100%.
Like, a powerful state might look at a weaker, resource-rich state, point to a human rights violation, and use that as a legal pretext to invade, topple the government, and install a puppet regime.
Which happens all the time, historically. So they prioritize the legal ban on the use of force above all else. In their view, maintaining world order by respecting absolute sovereignty is ultimately better for human development in the long run.
Even if it means ignoring a crisis in the short term.
Exactly. Because if we break the rules of sovereignty every time there is a crisis, the entire system of international trust breaks down. And disorder to the state-centered optimist makes any kind of global cooperation impossible.
Okay, but I have to push back on that logic. Going back to our homeowner's right to privacy analogy from earlier.
Sure.
If domestic abuse is actively happening inside the house, locking the front door doesn't protect the resident's right. It just traps them inside with the abuser.
That's a very fair point.
So is this rule-governed model just a very polite, highly legalistic excuse for diplomats to look the other way when terrible things happen, simply because it is politically inconvenient to act?
Well, that is the exact criticism leveled against the pluralist view. Critics argue it places an artificial legal construct, the state above the lives of actual human beings.
Yeah, valuing procedure over people.
Exactly. It values procedural order over moral substance. But before we write it off completely, we need to look at the second position on the matrix, which honestly offers an even darker view of the world.
Oh boy, okay.
This is the tragic and state-centered position.
Right, and this one is incredibly bleak. It basically views the world as an international state of nature where the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must.
Yes, this is the classic realist perspective in international relations theory. Realists completely reject the idea that states can ever agree on meaningful rules of coexistence, let alone shared moral rules.
They're just super cynical.
Very. The text cites E.H. Carr, who is a highly influential realist thinker, and he argued that whenever powerful states claim they are intervening for the sake of human protection or universal rights, it is entirely a facade.
Like a smokescreen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is just their own material strategic interests masquerading as universal morality.
So the realists don't believe states are capable of pure altruism at all.
Not even a little bit.
Like if a country sends troops to ostensibly stop a genocide, the realist looks at the map and says, well, they aren't there for the people. They are there because that country has deep water ports or oil reserves, or because it denies a rival superpower a foothold in the region.
Right. They strongly counsel against humanitarian activism because they think it always masks a self-interested power grab that ultimately destabilizes the global balance of power.
But the sources also point out that very few modern states will actually stand up at the UN today and openly admit to holding this purely cynical view, right? Like it's just bad PR.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible PR.
Yeah.
You can't say that into a microphone. But analytically, it is a crucial lens to understand the subtext of international disputes. However, the text also notes its limitations.
Which are
Well, to truly understand why states act, you have to look at more than just raw material power. You also have to look at how a state defines its national interests, which sometimes actually does include its self-image as a moral actor.
right. They want to be seen as the good guys.
Exactly. But let's shift over to the other side of the matrix, because the third position moves away from the state entirely. This is the optimistic and individual-centered view.
The liberal cosmopolitan view. And I feel like this is the most intuitive position for an average, everyday citizen to hold.
It definitely appeals to our common humanity.
Yeah, it argues that humanity is just a single, interconnected global community. Borders are essentially just imaginary lines drawn by historical accidents, and those lines shouldn't matter at all when human lives are actively being destroyed.
Right, the cosmopolitan quadrant, human rights are absolute and they are universal. Because of that, states don't just have a legal right to intervene to protect foreigners from tyranny. They have a positive moral duty to do so.
A duty, not just an option.
Yeah.
Exactly, a duty. The cosmopolitans argue that despite our cultural differences, we have actually agreed on minimum standards of human behavior globally.
Like basic human decency.
Right, we agree that genocide is wrong. We agree that torture is wrong. So intervention isn't about imposing one specific country's cultural will upon another. It is simply about enforcing the collective baseline morality of human society.
But the text notes that this view clashes violently with existing international law, right? The law, which was written by the state-centered optimists we talked about earlier, basically says stay out.
Yes.
But the cosmopolitans say you must go in, which leads us to the fourth and final position. And honestly, this one really surprised me when I was reading the source material.
The tragic and individual-centered view.
Yes, exactly. It just feels like the most conflicted group in the entire matrix.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because they are individual-centered, they care deeply about human rights, and they are absolutely devastated by human suffering.
Right, they have that empathy. But because they hold a tragic view of global politics, they are highly, highly skeptical of military intervention. They believe that deploying armed troops, dropping bombs, firing missiles into a complex political conflict almost always makes the situation worse for the civilians on the ground.
They argue that you cannot solve militaristic violence with more militaristic violence.
Exactly.
They think it just reinforces the very power structures that caused the humanitarian crisis in the first place. But what is their actual practical solution? Like, if you care deeply about the individual, but you absolutely refuse to pull the trigger to stop an abuser, what do you actually do?
Well, they advocate heavily for traditional nonviolent humanitarian assistance.
Okay, like what?
They want to flood the zone with food aid, medical supplies, doctors, logistical support for refugees. They want to treat the symptoms of the conflict without ever participating in the violence.
But wait, I mean, if an armed militia is actively sweeping through a region, executing civilians, dropping pallets of food doesn't stop the bullets?
No, it doesn't.
So how do you alleviate suffering, let alone prevent a massacre, without eventually taking a political and probably military stance against the aggressors?
And you have just hit on the exact limitation of the tragic individual-centered approach. Critics point out that neutrality in the face of mass atrocity is functionally impossible.
Right, because taking no action is still an action.
Yes, and practically speaking, if you provide food aid to a besieged city, The besieging army views you as an enemy combatant interfering with their military strategy.
Wow, yeah, that makes sense. So it is just an incredible intellectual framework presented by these sources. You have the pluralists who want strict legal boundaries to prevent chaos, the realists who think morality is just a geopolitical weapon, the cosmopolitans who demand we save everyone regardless of borders, and the humanitarians who fear that our attempts to save people with guns will only create more graves.
It is a profound tension, and yet this friction between these four viewpoints didn't just stay in academic textbooks.
No, it played out in the real world.
The intense moral discomfort of watching atrocities happen while diplomats just sat in rooms and argued over these exact philosophies is what slowly pushed the international community to start writing new rules.
Yeah, the realization that the old system of absolute sovereignty was just failing to protect millions of people basically forced a very slow, highly contested evolution of international norms and laws.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major section of our source material.
Right, let's trace that evolution. Because the text provides a historical timeline showing how the concept of civilian protection evolved through 8 distinct but interconnected streams. And honestly, I was pretty surprised to see it starts much further back than the United Nations, like all the way back in the 19th century.
Yeah, most people assume it all started post-1945, but the foundational texts for international humanitarian law are actually the 19th century Lieber Code and the emergence of the Red Cross movement.
Okay, so what was the Lieber Code exactly?
So the Lieber Code was a set of military rules designed by the U.S. government during the American Civil War, basically to dictate and limit the conduct of soldiers in the field.
Interesting.
It was really one of the first times a state explicitly codified that even in the midst of total war, there are limits to violence.
Like you can't just do whatever you want.
Right. And simultaneously over Europe, you had the birth of the Red Cross, which was championed by figures like Henry Dunant. He had witnessed the horrific aftermath of the Battle of Solferino and realized there needed to be a neutral, protected class of medical personnel allowed to treat the wounded on the battlefield regardless of what flag they flew.
Okay, but those early efforts were primarily focused on soldiers and battlefield medics,
Yeah,
right?
it's entirely military focused at first.
The real catalyst for modern international law protecting everyday civilians was the staggering horror of the Second World War. I mean, the mechanized slaughter of the Holocaust and the massive civilian death tolls from aerial bombing campaigns forced the world to realize the old rules were just entirely insufficient.
Absolutely. The scale of the tragedy changed everything.
So in 1948, the newly formed UN General Assembly approved the Genocide Convention.
And the Genocide Convention was revolutionary because of a very specific mechanism built into the text. It didn't merely define the crime of genocide and prohibit, it assigned all signatory states a binding legal duty to prevent it and to punish the perpetrators.
A binding legal duty.
Yes. Decades later, the International Court of Justice would clarify that this duty to prevent means states are legally obligated to employ all means reasonably available to them to stop a genocide from occurring, even if it's outside their own borders.
Wow, that is a massive legal burden.
It really is.
And it was followed almost immediately by the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which is where the concept of international humanitarian law is truly locked into place, right?
Exactly.
The sources specifically highlight Common Article 3, which committed all warring parties to respect the fundamental human rights of non-combatants.
And we really see that framework expand over time. Because by 1977, additional protocols were added to the Geneva Conventions to extend these protections to non-international armed conflicts.
Meaning civil wars.
Right, which was crucial because, as we noted earlier, most violence was now happening within states.
Yeah.
And these new rules strictly forbade deliberate attacks on civilians or civilian infrastructure.
So you can't bomb a hospital or a water treatment plant.
Exactly.
That legal baseline eventually paved the way for international campaigns to ban indiscriminate weapons like landmines and cluster munitions, which, disproportionately kill civilians long after a war ends.
Yes, those campaigns were a direct result of these evolving norms.
But the sources reveal a really interesting pattern here. The international community didn't just stop at a blanket, do not shoot civilians rule. They began to realize that different groups experience war in radically different ways, which required broadening the scope to address specific vulnerabilities.
Right. The rigid definitions of international law often fail to match the chaotic reality on the ground. So, for example, in 1951, the UN established the Refugee Convention, which was overseen by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner. for refugees.
Right.
And this established the legal concept of asylum, granting people who were fleeing persecution the right to cross an international border and claim safety. It stipulated that they cannot be legally forced back to a country where they face death or torture.
Okay, but the text notes a massive gap in that system that became glaringly obvious in the 1990s, right? Internally displaced persons, or IDPs.
Yes, IDPs became a huge issue.
These are people who are forced from their homes by violence, their villages are burned, they are fleeing for their lives, but they never actually managed to cross an international border.
Exactly. And because they haven't crossed a border under the strict letter of international law, they are not refugees.
So they have no protections.
Well, they're still within their home country, which means they're still legally the responsibility of their own government,
Right.
the very government that is often the one bombing them.
Which brings us right back to the sovereignty paradox.
Exactly. And because it was technically a domestic sovereign issue, there was zero political appetite among UN member states for a binding international treaty to protect IDPs. States absolutely did not want the UN dictating how they handle internal population movements.
So how did the international community bypass that sovereign roadblock to actually help these people?
Through a very pragmatic workaround. Without a formal treaty, the UN simply asked the UNHCR to extend its operational mandate to cover IDPs. Then UN officials, heavily guided by experts like Francis Deng, drafted a set of guiding principles for the treatment of internally displaced persons.
So it wasn't a hard law.
No, it wasn't hard international law, but it created a really powerful normative framework that aid agencies could use to pressure governments and coordinate relief efforts.
That's fascinating. And the sources highlight another really vital shift in recognizing specific vulnerabilities around the year 2000.
Oh, UN Resolution 1325.
Yes. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 1325, which launched the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Because before this, sexual violence and conflict was often brushed aside by military commanders as just tragic, inevitable collateral damage of war.
Just boys being boys in a war zone, sort of
Yeah.
horrific mentality.
Exactly. But Resolution 1325 formally recognized the devastating systemic use of sexual and gender-based violence as a deliberate strategic weapon of war designed to terrorize and destroy communities.
And that formal recognition changed the institutional machinery of the UN. It led to the creation of a special representative to the Secretary General focused permanently on sexual violence and conflict.
It created actual infrastructure.
Yes, it instituted mandatory annual reporting mechanisms and required the deployment of specialized women's protection advisors within UN peacekeeping missions.
Wow.
We also saw parallel initiatives emerge for children in armed conflict, creating mechanisms to address the unique horrors they face, such as the abduction and recruitment of child soldiers by armed militias.
Okay, so we have all these new laws, conventions, and norms. But reading through the sources, it becomes pretty clear that any law is fundamentally meaningless without an enforcement mechanism.
It's just a suggestion without enforcement.
Right. If a dictator knows they can burn a village and face zero consequences, the Geneva Conventions are just ink on paper. And that realization led to the rise of international criminal justice, culminating in the 1998 Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, or the ICC.
The creation of the ICC was designed to pierce the veil of state sovereignty at the highest possible level. The goal was to end the era of impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
Because before this, leaders could just hide behind their title right.
Historically, yes. Heads of state or high-ranking generals could shield themselves behind the concept of sovereign immunity, arguing that as the state's representatives, they could not be personally prosecuted by foreign courts. The ICC established the principle of individual criminal responsibility.
And the mechanics of how the ICC claims jurisdiction are super interesting because it operates on this principle of complementarity.
Right.
It doesn't act as a global police force just overriding local courts. It only steps in if a national legal system is genuinely unwilling or unable to investigate and prosecute these grave crimes itself.
That is the theory, yes.
Yeah.
However, looking at the geopolitical reality presented in our sources, the ICC faces a massive structural handicap.
Let me guess the major powers aren't on board.
Exactly. Three of the most powerful, heavily armed states in the world, the United States, Russia, and China, are not members of the court. They have refused to ratify the Rome Statute, meaning they do not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over their own citizens or their military personnel.
Which honestly seems like a fatal flaw for a court claiming universal jurisdiction. I mean, if the biggest military powers on Earth can simply opt out, how can the ICC possess any real authority? Doesn't it just become a court that only prosecutes leaders from weaker nations who lack the geopolitical leverage to ignore the warrants?
That is a very common and very sharp critique. The absence of the major powers absolutely complicates the ICC's universal legitimacy and its practical reach. I mean, the court relies entirely on member states to arrest suspects. It has no police force of its own.
They can't just send in a SWAT team.
Right. So when the U.S. or China ignores a warrant, it highlights the severe limits of international law. Yet what's fascinating here is that the sources suggest the ICC still projects a powerful deterrent effect.
Even without the big three.
Yes, because the mere existence of a permanent mechanism for accountability changes the risk calculus for leaders worldwide. A sealed indictment from The Hague can permanently restrict a leader's ability to travel, access international banking, or engage in diplomacy.
It makes their world much, much smaller.
Exactly. But it is vital to understand that the push for accountability isn't strictly confined to criminal courts. We also have to look at the mechanics of peer-to-peer review in the human rights space.
Okay, you are referring to the UN Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review process, right? This is essentially a mechanism where every single state in the UN has to sit down and let every other state grade their human rights homework.
That is a great way to put it. Every member state undergoes this compulsory review every few years. They have to submit reports, answer questions from other nations, and respond to documentation provided by non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch.
But there are no arrest warrants issued here, right? And no threats of military intervention.
No, none of that. But the mechanism relies on immense psychological and diplomatic pressure.
See, I am pretty skeptical that a bad review at the UN actually stops a dictator. I mean, if a regime is actively suppressing a domestic uprising, are they really going to stop firing into the crowds because an ambassador from Sweden read a sternly worded statement in Geneva?
Well, in the middle of an active civil war, a peer review will absolutely not stop the bullets.
Right.
But as a preventative tool during peacetime or low-level conflict, the sources indicate it is surprisingly effective.
Really? How so?
States deeply desire legitimacy on the world stage. Being publicly shamed and having your human rights abuses entered into the official UN record makes it much harder for a state to secure favorable trade deals, foreign investment, or military alliances.
Oh, so that hits them in the wallet.
Exactly. The spotlight effect nudges states toward compliance because the diplomatic and economic cost of ignoring the pressure just becomes too high.
Okay, so treaties, courts, and peer reviews form the preventative architecture. They build the normative pressure. But the sources then pivot to the ultimate nightmare scenario, which is what happens when all that deterrence fails.
When things completely break down.
Right, when the dictator ignores the UN review, ignores the threat of the ICC, and orders the military to just start exterminating a minority population. The international community realized they needed a doctrine for an immediate muscular response.
Which brings us to the most significant conceptual shift regarding sovereignty since the founding of the United Nations. The adoption of the responsibility to protect, commonly known as R2P.
Yes. The sources detail how R2P was formally adopted at the 2005 UN World Summit. And the timing here is critical. The international community was still living in the dark shadow of the 1990s.
They really were.
They had watched the genocide in Rwanda, where 800,000 people were slaughtered, while UN peacekeepers were basically ordered to stand by and do nothing. And they had witnessed the massacre in Srebrenica in Bosnia. R2P was born out of a desperate consensus that the UN could never let that happen again.
R2P fundamentally re-engineered the legal definition of sovereignty. It declared that sovereignty is no longer just a state's right to control its territory and demand non-interference. Sovereignty is inherently a responsibility to protect the populations living within that territory.
So to understand how this actually operates in the real world, let's look at the mechanics. If a state starts abusing its people, what is the actual legal trigger that forces the UN to act? The text outlines R2P in 3 specific pillars. What is the baseline requirement in Pillar 1?
So Pillar 1 establishes that every individual state has the primary responsibility to protect its own populations from 4 explicitly defined atrocity crimes.
Which are?
Genocide war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It places the burden firmly on the sovereign government first.
Okay, but what happens if a state actually wants to protect its people but it lacks the resources, or maybe it is facing a heavily armed insurgency that it just cannot defeat alone.
That triggers Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is the commitment of the broader international community to encourage and assist states in fulfilling their Pillar 1 responsibilities.
This is helping them out.
Yes, this involves capacity building. It means the UN or regional bodies will provide logistical support, early warning systems, mediation teams, or economic assistance to help the state stabilize the situation before it erupts into mass violence.
But the whole system, the part that gets all the attention, really hinges on Pillar 3. What happens when the state itself is the one committing the atrocities? Like, what if the government is the one actively organizing the ethnic cleansing?
Pillar 3 is the most controversial element of modern international relations.
No doubt.
It states that if a national authority is manifestly failing to protect its populations from those 4 specific crimes, the international community has the responsibility to respond in a timely and decisive manner through the UN Security Council.
Meaning invoking Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
Exactly.
This is the heavy artillery of international law. It authorizes the Security Council to implement coercive measures. They can freeze the country's central bank assets, implement crippling arms embargoes, and ultimately authorize the use of international military force to physically stop the killing.
It's the ultimate trump card.
Over time, the UN Security Council has actually invoked R2P language in over 40 different resolutions. But as we know, theory is clean and reality is incredibly messy.
Very messy.
The sources provide concrete case studies of how Pillar 3 actually plays out on the ground, starting with a massive watershed moment. Libya in 2011.
All right, so the Arab Spring uprisings had swept through the Middle East and North Africa. In Libya, anti-government protests escalated into an armed rebellion against the regime of Muammar Gaddafi.
And Gaddafi did not hold back.
No, he responded with overwhelming military force, publicly referring to the rebels as rats and threatening to go house to house in the city of Benghazi to just wipe them out. The international community genuinely believed a massacre was imminent.
So what did the UN do?
In response, the UN Security Council swiftly passed resolutions 1970 and 1973.
Resolution 1970 basically implemented arms embargoes and referred the situation to the ICC, right? But Resolution 1973 was the historic pivot.
Yes.
It authorized member states to take all necessary measures, which is essentially UN diplomatic code for military force to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack.
They established a no-fly zone, effectively grounding Gaddafi's air force, and NATO launched a bombing campaign against Libyan military assets. What makes this a watershed moment is that it was the very first time in the history of the Security Council that the use of military force was authorized for human protection purposes without the consent of the host state.
They kicked the door down.
Yes, they explicitly invoked Pillar 3 of R2P overriding Libya's sovereignty to stop the impending slaughter in Benghazi.
Now, the initial intervention achieved its stated goal, right? The massacre in Benghazi was prevented, but the mechanics of the intervention rapidly expanded.
It did.
The NATO bombing campaign essentially became the air force for the rebel army on the ground, eventually leading to the complete overthrow of the Gaddafi regime and his execution in the streets. This perceived mission creep from protecting civilians to orchestrating forced regime change completely shattered the consensus at the UN.
Countries like Russia and China, who had abstained from the vote to allow the intervention to proceed, were furious.
They felt tricked.
It's exactly. They argued that the Western powers had hijacked a humanitarian resolution to achieve a geopolitical goal, basically toppling a government they didn't like. That breakdown in trust had catastrophic consequences, which becomes painfully evident when we examine our second case study from the sources, Syria.
The contrast here is just devastating. The Syrian conflict began around the exact same time in 2011, also stemming from the Arab Spring. The regime of Bashar al-Assad deployed horrific violence against civilians, utilizing barrel bombs, chemical weapons, starvation sieges.
Just unimaginable brutality.
But the international response was completely paralyzed. Why did Libya get a military intervention within weeks while Syria was allowed to bleed for over a decade?
The paralysis in Syria was entirely due to the mechanics of the UN Security Council's veto power.
The famous veto.
Right. The Security Council has 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, and any one of them can unilaterally veto any resolution regardless of how many other countries support it. In the case of Syria, Russia and China were determined not to let the Western powers repeat the Libya playbook.
Plus, Russia had other interests there.
Yes. Russia also had deep strategic and military ties to the Assad regime, including naval bases in Syrian territory.
So whenever a resolution was drafted to condemn Assad or to impose sanctions or to threaten intervention under R2P principles, Russia and China simply raised their hands and vetoed it.
The system gridlocked.
Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and millions were forced to flee, creating a massive global refugee crisis, while the UN Security Council literally just sat in New York and argued over procedure.
The text does mention Resolution 2165, which was passed in 2014 as a desperate half measure. It authorized humanitarian aid convoys across international borders into rebel-held areas of Syria without the consent of the Syrian government.
Which is something, but not enough.
It was a significant step for humanitarian access, but let's be honest, it was a tacit admission that the UN was incapable of decisive political or military action to actually stop the war.
The failure in Syria severely damaged the credibility of R2P at the UN level. But the sources also highlight that the United Nations is not the only actor in this space. Regional bodies are increasingly taking the lead on human protection.
Yes, the European Union, for instance, has developed a robust framework for civilian protection missions. A prime example in the text is Operation Artemis in 2003, where the EU deployed a French-led multinational military force to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to stabilize the Ituri region and protect civilians from horrific ethnic violence.
And the African Union presents a really fascinating legal evolution as well. The text points out that their constitutive act includes Article 4.8, which explicitly enshrines the right of the African Union to intervene in a member state to stop genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
And what is incredible about that is that the AU codified this right to intervene in 2000, which is 5 years before the UN adopted the responsibility to protect.
They were ahead of the curve.
The African Union's progressive stance was a direct response to the failure of the international community during the Rwandan genocide. African leaders recognized they needed the legal architecture to handle crises internally without waiting for New York to give them permission.
Has it been used, though?
The text notes that while Article 4 hasn't been formally triggered for a non-consensual military invasion because African leaders still heavily value sovereign stability, the principle itself has deeply influenced robust peacekeeping mandates in places like Darfur, Mali, and Somalia.
It sets the tone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN bloc, which has historically maintained an ironclad rule of absolute non-interference in domestic affairs, has slowly begun establishing mechanisms to address human rights concerns among its members.
But looking at all these case studies, Libya, Syria, the DRC, we arrive at an inherent massive contradiction at the heart of this entire framework.
The paradox of violence.
Yes, exactly. When we talk about Pillar 3 of R2P or Article 4 off, we are essentially talking about using military violence. We are talking about launching airstrikes, destroying infrastructure, deploying armed soldiers to teach a sovereign government that it is wrong to use violence against its people.
It's circular.
Can you truly protect human security by escalating a war?
You have identified the core paradox of human protection right there.
Yeah.
You are attempting to enforce human rights through warfare, which is a mechanism that inherently destroys human rights. You cannot drop a bomb on a city without risking civilian casualties.
You just can't.
This paradox is why applying these theories is such an agonizing, fraught endeavor. And to truly understand how policymakers navigate this paradox, we need to look at the gritty, practical realities on the ground.
Okay, let's do a little exercise here. I want you to put on your practitioner's hat for a minute. Step fully out of the theoretical frameworks. Let's pretend I'm interviewing you as a human security and R2P expert.
Oh, I like this. Okay, I'm ready.
All right, so Mr. Expert, if the international community possesses the Genocide Convention, the ICC, the concept of R2P, and regional frameworks like the EU and the AU, why does it continually look like the UN is completely incapable of stopping violence? Why do interventions fail so frequently?
Well, because there is a fundamental selection bias in how we view the United Nations. The criticism is valid, but it misunderstands the UN's role. The UN only gets the impossible cases.
What do you mean by impossible cases?
Think of the international system like a healthcare network. If a political conflict is minor, it is resolved locally. If it escalates, maybe a regional body steps in to mediate. By the time a crisis has metastasized to the point where the UN Security Council is actively debating a military intervention, the situation is already a catastrophic failure.
It's too late.
Right? The country is likely awash in weapons. Society is fractured along deep ethnic or religious lines, and all preventative diplomacy has completely collapsed. We judge the UN based entirely on its performance in the geopolitical intensive care unit, where the survival rate is inherently very low.
Wow. Okay, that reframes the failure rate significantly. But let me press you on the mechanics of resources. If we, as a global society, universally agree that preventing genocide is a moral imperative, why is it continually so difficult to generate the funding, the helicopters, the troop commitments necessary for these massive peacekeeping operations?
It ultimately comes down to the brutal reality of finite global capacity and domestic political survival.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning morality is infinite, but budgets are strictly finite. The sources highlight that state capacity has been severely strained in recent decades. After the 2008 global financial crisis, and then again following the massive economic shock of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, governments worldwide faced severe domestic austerity.
So when a political leader is sitting in their capital looking at a massive budget deficit, how do they justify spending billions of dollars on a foreign intervention?
Frankly, they often can't. When a government has to choose between funding a massive peacekeeping deployment to a distant continent or funding their own domestic healthcare system, rebuilding their own infrastructure, or shoring up social welfare programs, political gravity dictates they must prioritize their own citizens.
It's political suicide otherwise.
Exactly. A politician who cuts domestic hospital funding to pay for foreign helicopters will simply not survive their next election. Protecting foreign populations competes directly with domestic priorities for a shrinking pool of political capital.
Okay, let's bring this calculus closer to home, especially for our listeners who closely follow European and specifically Danish politics.
Sure.
How do smaller states navigate these massive intervention debates within regional security frameworks like NATO or the EU?
If we connect this to the bigger picture for a country like Denmark or any European state integrated into these alliances, political and diplomatic capital are scarce resources that must be managed ruthlessly.
They have to pick their battles.
Absolutely. These governments are constantly forced to weigh the genuine moral urge to intervene and stop atrocities against the potential for geopolitical blowback, domestic unpopularity, and the stability of their broader strategic goals. They are forced to make agonizing trade-offs that rarely ever make it into the headlines.
And the sources actually offer a really profound example of this exact type of trade-off regarding the crisis in Darfur in 2003. Explain the mechanics of that diplomatic agony for us.
In 2003, the government of Sudan was orchestrating a horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing against populations in the Darfur region. Hundreds of thousands were dying. The international community, including European states, had significant diplomatic and economic leverage over the Sudanese government in Khartoum.
And activists were screaming for severe sanctions and intervention, right?
Yes, loud demands for action. But many states deliberately chose not to press the Sudanese government too hard.
Why? I mean, if they had the leverage, why hold back while people were being slaughtered?
Because at that exact same moment, international diplomats were painstakingly negotiating a peace deal to end Sudan's separate decades-long civil war with rebels in the south, a war that had already killed millions.
Oh, wow.
The diplomats were terrified that if they used all their leverage to punish the Sudanese government over Darfur Khartoum, would just walk away from the peace table entirely.
So they had to mathematically weigh the ongoing cost of lives in Darfur against the potential to save millions of lives by securing peace in the south.
Exactly. They made the horrific calculation to prioritize the southern peace process, which eventually led to the creation of the independent nation of South Sudan in 2011. But that success was bought in part by muting the response to Darfur.
That is just crushing.
It is, but European states face these exact same balancing acts today. When a government in Copenhagen or Brussels decides whether to commit troops to a UN mission or support a NATO operation, they aren't just looking at the humanitarian need. They are analyzing how the intervention will impact migration flows, how it affects their relations with regional powers, and whether it aligns with their long-term treaty obligations. It is a complex, often soul-crushing calculus of risk versus reward.
That fundamentally strips away the illusion that international diplomacy is just a clear-cut battle between good and evil. It is a constant negotiation between competing disasters.
That is the perfect way to phrase it.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's distill this immense volume of information down into 3 core takeaways for you listening.
Takeaway number 1 is the fundamental structural challenge to sovereignty. The imperative to protect human life has rewritten the centuries-old rule of absolute state sovereignty. Because of the evolution of human rights norms, the Genocide Convention, and the doctrine of R2P, what a government does inside its own borders to its own people is now both legally and morally the business of the international community.
The locked front door is no longer an absolute impenetrable shield.
Exactly.
Takeaway number 2 focuses on the friction between ideals and realities. As we have explored deeply today, there is a constant tragic tension between the lofty universal ideals of saving lives and the harsh, unforgiving political, financial, and logistical realities of actually mounting a military or humanitarian intervention.
The UN inherits the world's most impossible crises.
Right. And states will ultimately always prioritize their own domestic survival and geopolitical interests over pure altruism.
And takeaway number 3 relates to how these concepts actively shape European and Danish policy. These debates regarding the responsibility to protect and the ethics of intervention are not purely academic.
Not at all.
They directly dictate how European nations allocate their defense budgets and structure their foreign policy. They must constantly balance their strict commitments to NATO and EU security frameworks with the moral demands of protecting vulnerable populations across the globe.
Which brings up a quick but important reminder. If you want a granular look at how these exact international pressures and moral trade-offs play out in the halls of power, specifically within Danish politics, you should really explore the weekly and monthly briefings we offer on our Patreon.
Highly recommend them.
The link is in the description. It is the best way to see the theoretical frameworks we've discussed today applied directly to the ongoing parliamentary debates and defense appropriations happening right now.
It really connects the broad theory of international relations to the specific realities of national policy.
That concludes our extensive exploration of human protection sovereignty and the agonizing choices of international intervention. If you found this deep dive illuminating, please follow the podcast on your preferred platform and take a moment to rate us 5 stars. It is the most effective way to help this series reach even more curious minds.
We have a fascinating shift in topic lined up for the next session.
We absolutely do. Next time on the summer series, we are leaving the battlefield and entering the digital realm to explore the vast world of connectivity, communications, and technology. We will be analyzing how the invisible digital architecture of our modern world is fundamentally reshaping the mechanics of diplomacy, national security, and human interaction.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over.
Go for it.
We have seen how the architecture of international law works, and we have seen exactly how and why it fails. So ask yourself this: if the entire history of modern intervention demonstrates that powerful states ultimately only deploy their resources and risk their soldiers when it aligns with their own strategic national interests, is a truly universal human rights regime actually possible? Or are we inevitably destined to live in a world defined by selective empathy, where the international community only intervenes to save the people it's politically convenient to save?
That is a profound and very uncomfortable question to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive and for bringing your curiosity to these heavy topics. We will catch you on the next one. Take care.